Have you ever walked out of your doctor's office feeling unheard, dismissed, or even experiencing medical gaslighting? This is something that happens very commonly, and you're not alone. And it's costing people with vaccine injuries, chronic illness, invisible illness, the care that they desperately need. Today, I'm joined by Ashley Grogg, a registered nurse and a fierce advocate for patient rights. Together, we'll be discussing some important components of why it's so important to be your own medical advocate or for your loved one, and some practical guidance on how to actually do that, especially in the face of medical gaslighting and a broken medical system. Welcome to Navigating the Unknown with Nikki, a podcast in collaboration with React19. Together, we share stories, support, and hope for those living with vaccine injury and chronic conditions. I'm Nikki, a physical therapist who has seen some of the background of the healthcare system and the inner workings, but also I've experienced this on a personal level, being a patient that has been vaccine injured, dealing with chronic illness, and navigating this broken system firsthand. So whether you're struggling with, like I said, vaccine injury, chronic illness, you've probably experienced times where you have had to be an advocate for yourself or a loved one, or have seen just how easily it is to have the ball dropped. If you've ever felt dismissed, unheard, or frustrated in the medical setting, then this episode is for you. So let's dive in. So thank you, Ashley, for being with us here today to bring some insight to this crucial topic of medical advocacy and gaslighting, because I know as someone who is vaccine injured, dealing with chronic illness, it's hard to navigate this broken medical system and get the care that you actually deserve. So let's start out. Give everybody a little bit of background, introduction to yourself, professionally and as an advocate, who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks for having me. So, as you said, my name's Ashley Grogg. I've been a nurse for nearly 20 years. I actually have a master's degree in nursing education. And unfortunately, because of what I saw and what I experienced in the healthcare world in the hospital, I I just couldn't continue in that line of work because I constantly felt like I was putting Band-Aids on people's problems, sending them home, waiting for them to get worse, and then come back in. And I really tried to incorporate some holistic modalities into my profession within the hospital. I helped develop a heart failure program and receive accreditation at a regional hospital near me. And so in that process, I was trying to really intertwine this holistic type care that I knew would help alleviate the symptoms of my patients, improve their quality of life. And I saw how, especially in this population, palliative care, where you reduce the symptoms, you provide symptom management, really helped improve their quality of life. And they had better outcomes because they weren't dealing with so many symptoms. And it was to the point where, because of staffing shortages, those interventions weren't being applied. It was just the medicines and the treatments. And a lot of times I felt like while they could extend life or maybe help for a little bit, it just kind of compounded the problem. And it was just a mess. And I hated it. And it was sucking the soul out of my body. So I left that and I started working with a large insurance carrier, which was really strange to think about because, when you think of helping patients, you don't think of insurance companies, unfortunately. But my position there was amazing when I first started. I was able to work with my patients to help them overcome the barriers to care, teach them how to advocate for themselves. And it was night and day difference. I mean, I watched people's A1Cs come down from 12 to like a 7, which that is miraculous. And there were patients who had suicidal ideation because multiple chronic conditions like rheumatoid arthritis and just a whole mess of problems. And they just felt alone and isolated. And I see that mirrored now. This was all pre-COVID. And that is amplified with all these COVID vaccine injured or just vaccine injured in general. And so, it was all of those things that led me to kind of move into a more holistic space and start advocating for the right to accept or decline vaccination. So I founded a nonprofit in my state, and we work legislatively to give people the right to say no. Because, I mean, where there's a risk, there must be choice, right? And,
Exactly.
unfortunately, I've had a lot of my own personal experiences in healthcare where I have been gaslit, where, people just want to kind of dismiss, and there are a lot of different reasons we can talk about that. But a big part of this, I believe, is why my mom died. She died at 48 of thyroid cancer, the most treatable kind of cancer. And for the longest time, her doctor told her it was all in her head and she needed to get a hobby. So that's a little bit of my background and why I'm so passionate about advocating for people, because if you can't fight for yourself, nobody else is going to.
That's right. I think a lot of us become advocates and stronger people willing to stand up for our rights when we have that personal experience, like you mentioned. Not only professionally do we see it, and that leads us a little bit more that direction, but personally, when you have one, there is no other teacher that is better than experience itself. So, when you hear the word medical advocacy, how would you define that? How would you define being a medical advocate for yourself and for your loved ones? Just what's that term?
Yeah. So advocacy basically is speaking out on behalf of someone, and you pair that with medical. You're speaking out on their behalf in regards to their medical conditions. And a lot of times we think of this as just being somebody to sit next to them. But no, you're like their little bulldog sitting next to them. And sometimes you have to snarl. Sometimes you are, nice and polite, and you got to be judicious about that. But your job is to be their brain when their brain might not be working fully, right? When you are in these critical situations yourself, from a scientific perspective, right? Your cortisol is through the roof. Maybe you have brain fog because of things that are going on. You're overwhelmed, you're emotional, you're worried about how all these things are going to impact your loved ones. And so you might not be able to ask those questions. So your medical advocate, if you can find somebody who can compartmentalize and who can separate the emotion from that situation and critically think, that is such a powerful tool, because it's always those moments when you walk out of that doctor's office and you're like, oh, I wish I would have asked whatever the question was. And
Exactly.
so, yeah, that's what I see as your medical advocate, when you're really looking for somebody who's going to be able to advocate for you, to speak up for you. That is somebody who's going to be able to kind of shut that emotion off to a certain extent, right? And to be able to ask those hard questions, to push through, to critically think, okay, they're saying this, but that doesn't match up with what, is going on. Or I feel like there's a little bit more we could work on right here. Those are all the things that you're looking for in a medical advocate.
So, you hear medical advocacy, but here recently you've heard this term a whole lot. And I think people are starting to recognize it and fight back against it because it's, in my opinion, has become more common. And that is medical gaslighting. So explain what medical gaslighting is. And also, just out of my curiosity, when you went through your schooling as a nurse, did you all have any kind of educational or curricular, content about medical gaslighting or any of that?
Yeah, that's that second part we're going to come back to. I'm gonna go over
Okay.
that basic definition, and basically when we're talking about gaslighting, it's when somebody's trying to convince you that what you are experiencing, feeling, the experience that you're having is not real, that it is in your head, or maybe even just you're perceiving it wrong. Like that's a popular way to kind of misdirect. No, that's just your perception, and your perception is wrong, or you don't have enough knowledge to understand these processes. And it's really dismissive. It's really hurtful, because they want you to believe their perspective based on a very limited view, they get 10 minutes with you. Like, they're supposed to understand and comprehend. And sometimes when you sit with a medical professional, they're going to read your chart. They're going to see some of those things going on. They're going to ask you some questions. And because their time is so limited, sometimes they won't let you finish your thought, or like, these conditions are kind of like octopus, right? You have this one issue, but then there's all these tentacles that go out into the different aspects of your life. And each of those tentacles are really important to getting to that root issue, right? And so you start talking about it, and then you don't get to finish your thought, and you get pulled over into this, other aspect. And so that can be really confusing. And then on top of that, they're asking questions that just like, I need you to slow down because I'm getting overwhelmed and I'm getting excited and I'm stressed out and I really want this appointment to go well. And there's so much riding on this 15 minutes with you. And yet I don't feel like I can get out what I need to say. And so it makes it very easy. And I think we're going to talk about this a little bit later. It makes it very easy for them to say, well, you're just so worked up and you're emotional and blah, blah, blah. And particularly with women, this is a huge issue, and it has been for decades. So, going back to my nursing education, gaslighting wasn't a term that was used, right? Like, I went to nursing school 20 years ago. So gaslighting was not really a thing back then. It was there, and we talked about our biases and looking at the patient as an individual, not necessarily, and this is backwards, but at the same time, it makes sense. You're supposed to look at the person with what their condition is and what's wrong with them. And you still have to maintain their humanity with that. But looking past the differences of opinion or what they've done, you're looking at what's going on with them, and you're trying to be very objective. This person is here in front of me. My job is to care for their health and provide them with the best tools, knowledge, and information so that way they can make choices for themselves. Whether you agree with those choices or not, your duty is to that patient and to help them achieve that best health outcome. And so that was talked about, but gaslighting definitely was not. And so it's very interesting, and I doubt it's being taught today.
Yeah, I hope that in our current educational system, it is a component of their curriculum, because it is huge. Because the only time you're going to understand that you're doing it is to be taught how to recognize it as the person that may be the culprit of, doing medical gaslighting. And I know for me, my education with my doctorate was 15 years ago. And we didn't have the word medical gaslighting, did not exist, that word that I knew of. And we didn't talk about it. We did talk about, like you said, the culture sensitivity and putting some of those things that may be different from your values or beliefs behind you and focusing on the patient to not let them bias you. But I certainly hope that it's a part of our education. And, that brings us, you've already touched on a few of these, but let's talk a little bit more. Why do you think doctors do this? I'm sure your response is going to be there's multiple reasons depending on the doctor and the situation. But, is it intentional? Is it not intentional? Is it personal bias? Is it, overburden healthcare system? What is the deal? Why do you think most people do this?
Yeah, you're 100% right. A combination of all of the above, and it depends on the individual person. And I think that this is what really stinks, is you as the patient have to go in there and find out, number one, are they actually going to listen to me? Are they going to take me seriously? Am I going to be able to communicate openly with them? And you have to decide how much energy and bandwidth and what the options are if you leave this provider, And you absolutely have the right to leave that provider. If you're not getting the care you deserve, you absolutely have that right. But I would encourage you to be careful. You don't want to cut all ties and burn all these bridges when you still need some of that care. And so you're kind of trapped in this really no-win situation, and you have to be a detective in finding out, why is this physician acting this way? Is it their personal bias that vaccines are safe and effective, period, and there's no way that I could possibly be experiencing this because of my vaccine injury? Is it because they are rushed and their feet are held to the fire by the insurance companies or the hospital corporation that they work for? But if you can have a candid conversation with that physician and kind of dig down into those pieces, I think it'll be helpful. One of the things that I talk about a lot is called moral injury. And moral injury is when you do something that goes against your morals, and then you have guilt and shame attached to it. And for some providers, this is a conscious, thing that they're facing and dealing with. And for some, it is subconscious. It's that underlying, maybe nagging at their soul, and they have that cognitive dissonance to the ability for vaccines to cause damage because they push them. They still encourage them. They're vaccinating or encouraging their patients to vaccinate, and maybe even their family members. And so if they have to face the fact that maybe they could have been part of the problem, that is very difficult. And I'm not making excuses, because once you know better, you do better, right?
Right.
So complex, but I think if you can approach them, and this is horrible and I hate saying this, but I want you to get your best care. And right now, if you can approach them with a compassionate heart, I think you'll have a better chance of them providing that back to you. And I'm sorry that that is the way that this is, but that's just kind of where we're at right now. And it's very frustrating to me because I've been on that other side of the bed. And it shouldn't be that way, but I think it's up to us to start demanding this treatment, to start bridging that gap between these providers who really want to do the right thing and feel like they're unable to do that.
It is. It's a hard situation to be there, but you're right. You definitely, you have to test drive it out and see if that provider is right for you, if they're willing to listen to you, because some aren't. And, as a healthcare provider, especially a doctor, you have a Hippocratic oath to whatever your code of ethics are, depending on your field of medicine. It's basically to do no harm, and that you will take care of your patient and, being transparent and give them a full picture of what's going on, pros and cons. But we are human. And you said it definitely is no excuse, because they're held to a higher standard in those professions. But you're a human. You're dealing with humans. We're not perfect. We let those personal bias seep in. Hopefully, the majority are unintentional, but there are intentional aspects where they are prideful. You have that white coat ego syndrome that we talk about, where people don't want to be wrong. And if they've been set in their ways for so long, it's hard to change that mindset or, admit, hey, I might be wrong. And so that creates bias. So you've got to find those healthcare providers out there that are willing to challenge their thought processes, because in my opinion, that is where we are. And that's why we have learned things that we've learned, because we're willing to challenge things we know and do research. And medicine and science is not set. It's always evolving. If we stay where we are and we aren't willing to question that, we're not going to have the improvements in the system that we have right now. So, you talked about the fact that you don't have to stay with that provider, although you want to be careful. You don't want to be one of those that are labeled as doctor hopping, because people do talk. There are connections you don't know between medical providers that can get you in trouble when you start hopping around, but you need to find the right person for you. So that brings us, I'm going to jump to the question as far as patient rights. What is your right as a patient? Obviously your doctor, you think of them as maybe someone on a higher pedestal that knows more. but you have rights as a patient too. What would you explain to those out there what their right is?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a difference between demanding care and declining care. Those doctors do have a duty to keep healthcare costs lower. They have responsibilities, but that doesn't mean you are completely closed off. And I think where this comes in is, first of all, I want to jump back to that last question. You illustrated it beautifully. When somebody has a closed mindset, when they are unwilling to open up and change, those are absolutely the doctors that you just discard. If they're not willing to meet you a little bit, it's time to just move on. Okay. If you need them for your prescriptions, and this is what I would always tell my patients, especially if it's a primary care provider, don't fire them until you have a new provider. Maybe you go test drive a couple new providers, but do not fire them until you find a new provider. And so the line is really blurry as far as patient rights. You can absolutely refuse any treatment. You absolutely have that undeniable right to refuse treatment. But as far as saying like, okay, I want to get a CT or I want this kind of test, that's where it becomes more difficult, because you could go out and get a CT, but your insurance might not cover it. And you don't have the right to force them to do that. There are certain, quote, hoops that you have to kind of jump through with your insurance company and with the doctors. And a lot of times, especially if you're on Medicaid or maybe Medicare, you cannot work around that unless you do private pay, which really stinks. Now, there are a lot of laws coming out in all the states that talk about transparency and cost transparency. And recently I had a client tell me that, because I do functional medicine and I don't take over and assume care, but I'll collaborate with a provider. But they were telling me that they would be able to go get an MRI for $300 and I know, I was shocked.
Really?
Yeah, it was crazy, but they were telling me that they could go get an MRI. And I said, I think you balance the risks. Is that going to tell you, because this client is seeking alternative treatment, stem cell injections, and they're debating on whether or not to move more into a more traditional path of care, or whether they should continue down the road of stem cell. And so that diagnostic might be helpful to see, give them more information. And so you need to be able to collaborate and work with your provider. And I think that if you come in and you sit down and you are able to have a real honest conversation and say, these are my concerns, this is why I feel this is needed. Can you explain to me why I shouldn't be able to pursue this path of treatment? And really just, it's like functional medicine. Get to the root of the issue. Why are they opposed to it? Are the risks outweighing the benefits? If so, what are those risks? Is your current situation more risky than what the risks are by not treating something that you have going on or not having that information? Getting to the root of that problem. And I think that it stinks that your, quote, rights to access care are dependent on your ability to pay for it. But I don't want to get into socialized medicine. That's a conversation for another day, right?
Right. We definitely have a lot of barriers beyond the actual provider for access, and depending on what country you're in, you have different barriers. But as far as the healthcare provider, they are the gatekeeper, and you do have rights. You definitely have a right to refuse and find healthcare otherwise, with a different provider. But in the end, for your insurance to kick in and actually pay for it, unless you can find a deal like that out of pocket, which some do offer that, and you pay versus billing through insurance. But when it comes down to wanting your insurance to cover something, the doctor most of the time has to write an order or a referral or things like that. And if they are steadfast in that they're not going to do it, you have to question respectfully, hey, what are you thinking? Why don't I need this? Or they may be thinking, well, I know what insurance is going to say. They're going to deny it. So I'm going to have you try this out first. And then we'll come back and talk about maybe that next step that we're wanting. So maybe it might be that they're not completely objected to it, that you just have to jump through the hoops because they also know a medical system and insurance. And I've seen that happen with therapy versus getting imaging, trying to do different things versus, going straight to an MRI. But I think it's important to know you do have the right to speak up and you don't have to stay with that provider. But it's important to have that continuity in care. Like you said, don't drop one until you find another, because there are things that come up that you do need that maybe you disagree on some points, but they are the gatekeeper to healthcare and insurance paying a lot of times.
Well, and I think too, the other thing with that is, they may want to be able to write that order. They may want you to be able to receive that care, but they may not be able to because the insurance. And I think that's where the ability to have those really candid conversations and to have a relationship with your doctor, because they can be one of your greatest advocates or they can be your worst enemy. And so
Really?
being able to find that provider that you can have that relationship that isn't going to mind, and sometimes I think because I'm a very direct person and sometimes I can come across to very rude. Like if you don't know, you're laughing because this is so true.
Hey,
But
you're a little bit more northern and I'm a little bit more southern.
yeah,
So there's
yeah.
some differences too.
So it's the Yankee in me is what you're saying. No, because people up here are like, oh, she's abrasive. But I don't think it's just geographical. It's just the way I've always been. I'm just very direct. And so I think that the tone that you use, and if you start out by saying something like, listen, I'm not trying to be argumentative. I'm really struggling with this, and I'm hoping that you will help be my advocate. I am dependent on you and where this goes. And so I really want to be able to understand and work with you on this. And I'm sorry, this is difficult, but I want to make sure that I get the care I deserve. And I know sometimes that's out of your hands, but can we talk about how to get, to this place? And that's very disarming. That's like, okay, I'm going to put my pitchfork down now. And I want to come to you and I want to hold your hand and I want to talk to you about this. So that way we can, you're a person now. You just come to me and shifted the gear from maybe a raging crazy person to somebody who is seeking compassion. And, depending if you're able to articulate that and you're able to show them that you're wanting to work together, but you're just overwhelmed and you really are somewhat dependent on them. If that does not change their perspective a little bit, that's going to be a really good sign that it might be time to find that other doctor, and start interviewing.
Yes, absolutely. We're going to come back to that because that is a really good way to learn to communicate. Sometimes we let emotions bog us down and we get caught up in those and we come off of us as abrasive, or, it puts them in a position where they put their defense up and you're not going to get anywhere. But going back to that, where you said, hey, it might be time to find you a different provider. What are some of those signs when you go in to see somebody that you might be in a situation where you need to look at a different provider, or it might be the little bells going off in your head, hey, I need to be more of an advocate? What are some of the things that you've heard or seen? I know you've mentioned a couple already that you see when this happens with medical gaslighting or where you need to stand up to be an advocate.
Yeah. So first of all, your intuition is more powerful than what you think. And I just want to give you that as a gift. And I hope that you take it and you hold it close to your heart and you remember that, because there are going to be a lot of people out there who dismiss intuition. And when you can sit down across from somebody, when you can look them in the eye, you can really tell a lot about a person and whether they're going to be there for your best intent. Now, with that being said, I used to work with a cardiologist who I'm pretty sure was on the spectrum somewhere. A brilliant, brilliant man who I love dearly, but his ability to communicate with patients was non-existent. I mean, like, what's that show, The Good Doctor? Did you ever
The
watch
Good
that?
Doctor.
Okay.
Mhm.
Sean Murphy was this
Uh-huh.
doctor, and he
Gotcha.
was brilliant and he loved his patients, but being able to communicate with them was not his strong suit. And so, you have to be careful because you don't want to write somebody off. And again, like myself, I am very like hard exterior, super softy on the inside. And when I go into business mode, like I'll just fire questions. I'm straight faced, like, let's get this done, workhorse mode. And so you got to be careful with that, but trusting that intuition, having those conversations, asking the questions, um, this is something that you kind of have to play with and see, because not everybody is going to approach situations the same way, meaning you as the patient, what I might be comfortable with, you might not be. So you have to kind of test those waters, see what has worked for you in the past and test it out. But just coming from that genuine place of inquiry, I think is your best place to start. You go, you sit down, you kind of get a feel for who they are, and you can ask for things. Say, hey, I really struggle with communication when I'm not looking you in the face. I know you've got a lot of paperwork to do. Recognizing their struggle, right? Even though, again, this sucks that you have to do this. And a lot of doctors' offices I've seen have gone to transcriptionists that come in the room with them. So that is kind of a blessing. But, I understand that you have a tight schedule, but I really need the next 15 minutes to get this off my chest, or 10 minutes, or whatever. Or even using written communication. I tell patients all the time to take a journal, or to try to set your problems out in a format before you go to the doctor. That way you can be very succinct. And forgive me, because I know with vaccine injury, like, nothing's succinct, right?
Right.
There's nothing succinct about vaccine injury, because you have a mile-long list of diagnoses and inflammation is just like everything, right?
Uh-huh.
So, I have an advocacy class, and I've given you the link to that and a code for
Yes, we will
60.
put it in the description.
Yeah,
So check it out.
60% off. There's also some free worksheets that I have on my website that people are more than welcome to go and grab and take those and use those. But you're just going to have to play around with this, and don't be afraid to be humble and say, look, I'm sorry. I know last time we got off on the wrong foot. I'm just really scared right now. And again, that's like, okay, I'm going to put down my pitchfork. That's very disarming. And if they're not responding to those disarming statements, they don't they're not cutting the mustard, as some might say,
All right. Yeah. I mean, and like you said, you do have that intuition, that gut feeling. And a lot of times there is validity to it, and you have to listen to that. You can tell how they're going to respond. I think another red flag that I've seen myself, if you're able to, we have access to our medical record. So after you see someone, if you got a bad vibe and you're not really sure, were they listening or are they not? Were they pushing me off? I've found a lot of times I go back and I read their actual note, because I will find things in their note that they didn't say verbally to me that are coming out in their note that are like, they are dismissing me. They are not hearing me. They are pushing it off on something else. And I think it is very crucial to go back and actually read your notes. And for me, for the first 2 years, especially, every time I left a doctor's office, I would either get a copy of the note, or I'd come back and I'd get the note, or it'd be, electronically, you could have access to it and read them. And even if you need somebody to help you out with some of the medical lingo, definitely do it. Google the words if you need to, but read them, because you're going to find out a whole lot, as I did, by just reading that too. But with this, you also have, like, you know, you were talking about the journaling, coming in there prepared. And I know I record symptoms. I keep track of different things, especially when something is going on that's new, or the doctor, is questioning what's going on. And so I'll come down and maybe I'll track my blood pressure, I'll track my heart rate, or I'll say, hey, this symptom happened after I did this. And I write it down just like you said. Are there any other preparation things that can help prepare people to go into these visits?
Yeah, I recommend, and I don't know that this is on the free handouts, but putting it in a format that doctors are used to, and it's called SBAR, and you can Google this. Situation, what's going on. Background, what's happened in the past, what you've tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked. Assessment, what you think you'd like to do next. Is it labs? Is it testing? All that stuff. And then the recommendation, that's the last part of the S bar. That might not be something that you fill out and do. Maybe that's something that's the portion you work on with your doctor. But putting it in that format where it's organized and getting your thoughts together, because again, we go back into that kind of like fight or flight mode when we're going into these doctor's appointments. We're worried about them judging us. We're worried about what the response is going to be. We're worried about not getting any answers, all these things that we're facing. And so it makes it really hard for us to focus on clearly articulating or saying what we're there for. And so if you can ahead of time, situation, background, assessment, if you can write that out clearly and you can have a good example of what's going on, it's going to make that communication so much easier. Even if it's written out, you can say, look, I'm not the best at communicating verbally. I wrote this out in preparation for you. So you're letting them know your limitations or that you get nervous and that you're struggling. And so that helps improve the communication. And that is a form of advocacy because you're saying, look, this is something I struggle with, and I think that this would help our communication. How can we build this relationship? And it's fine to say that. Like, please say that. How do you think we can most effectively achieve this goal? And maybe that's one of the first things that you do when you ask when you're interviewing that new provider. How do you think we can work best together? This is my strength. This is my weaknesses. Where are you at? And again, these are disarming questions. This is telling the physician that you want to work in a collaborative fashion with them, that you are not going to, try to attack them. And I will sometimes tell my providers, look, I am a very strong personality, and I typically just don't mean things the way that they come out. And again, you're laughing because you so know this is true. But I'm trying to solve a problem, and a lot of times I just get so excited that it just comes out the wrong way. And so if you are upfront and you share those things, and again, they are receptive and they want to work collaboratively with you, that is another positive sign moving into this space where you can really work well together. So, all of these things are in that advocacy masterclass, and I think I have them outlined on the free self-advocacy guide. I talk about risk-benefit analysis on there, so you can do that. And that's another great way is if a doctor recommends something and is telling you, hey, I think this is in your head. I think you really need a psych evaluation, Nikki. This is really tough and I understand. And you're such a sweet person, blah, 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 but ultimately it's all in your head. When you pull out and you know how to do the risk benefit analysis, or you can go over this situation, background, what's worked, what hasn't worked, all those things, and say, okay, so what if this is actually physiological? Have we ruled out these issues? Is there a reason? Can you explain the reason to me? So you're putting them in a position where they get the opportunity to educate you, right?
Yeah.
That's what we go to doctors for, education.
Mhm.
Can you educate me on why we wouldn't do this versus this? And coming from that place of not aggression, but a place of help me understand this.
Mm-hmm. I do. I think that it is all on what position you come from. We talked about different doctors respond different ways, just like we respond differently. And I think it is very crucial the way that you actually come at them, because it tends, people with higher intelligence or in a higher professional level, they tend to be more offended or be on the defense when it comes to you questioning their knowledge, typically. And so you have to do that in such a way that you're showing your vulnerability of, hey, this is where I'm lacking knowledge, or this is where I need your help, and you are going to be a big part of that help. Can you please explain? So you're tapping in to, hey, this is what I'm good at. I know this. I'm going to help you. And they're really wanting to know and get my help. So you've learned to question a doctor without being like, no, you're wrong. That isn't going to work. Versus, I've thought about that, and I've tried this and this. What about, what if it's not working, or what if this is the issue? Do you think it might even be this, or do you think we might need to try this? Because at that point, it engages their critical thinking, it engages their need, your need for them, and they like that. So I think it's important. But there's another thing that I wanted to talk about. And we talked about, as far as the doctors and how there's bias going on, and maybe even reading the personal records and the notes from the visit. There's something that some people don't think about that our medical system is going to, and that's electronic medical records and the systems and all the links. And, those background factors that may not be something you do think about, that I want people to be aware of. And I know that you probably have the same issues and thoughts when it comes to, how do you think our system and the things that people should know, what are those when it comes to how our system is driven by insurance, by farm, by electronic medical records being linked? All of these outside factors that when you're in the room talking to the doctor, you don't think about, but have already gone on and are in place in the system. How do you think all those variables, and what variables people should know about?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's so much I can say on this. First of all, we've already kind of talked about insurance, right? We've
Yes.
hit that pretty good with the fact that there are certain like steps and levels that they have to go through. Like with therapy, a lot of times you'll have to go do physical therapy for a little while before you can go get imaging. And then you have to work through those hoops. Some labs are held until later, until you've ruled out these other less expensive things. So obviously those factors, we've talked about the time limitations and the fact that these doctors, unless they're independent or have a large amount of control, they're usually stacked with 15-minute scheduling. And so their time frame is very limited. And that's where that communication key comes in and is key, because if you can effectively communicate very quickly, that's very helpful. The thing that I want to touch on the most that you have said is the electronic medical record. And I don't know if we have talked about this, or if maybe you've seen something that I'm working on with my state advocacy group. I empower my members to go out and be part of the change, because I can't do it all. I'm one person, and they bring amazing information to me. And this past summer, one of my members brought to me the name of something called the Indiana Health Information Exchange. And obviously by the name, you know that this is in Indiana, but this is happening across the country. And in our state, our Indiana Health Information Exchange is a private nonprofit. So it's separate from the hospitals. It's obviously not government run, which I'm kind of grateful for, but it feeds into government entities, and they, being the hospitals, doctors, independent lab companies, the independent radiological centers, are all sending our entire medical record into this Indiana Health Information Exchange. And what's happening is then they are selling this access to this information to the tune of $17.6 million. This is just in Indiana, okay? They're selling this access to this information. And what's been happening is I've had reports, and people have asked me this before I knew what was going on. They said, I went to the doctor this is somebody from Indiana traveling to Michigan. So if you're a global audience member, it's the state north of us. They're going to a doctor there, and they knew my medical history. They were able to read, about my allergies. And when we think back about that conversation we just had, and how you were explaining how important it is to read those notes, these patients seeking second opinions, it's very difficult for them to actually achieve that second opinion because of the fact that that doctor may be able to go in and read, and then they have this preconceived notion that you are crazy, that you are a drug seeker, that you are a bored housewife, as my mother was called, and I might be a little bit bitter about that. But, they have this preconceived notion before even sitting down with you. And one doctor who either just was having a bad day or maybe was just kind of a jerk, whatever, one doctor can shape the care that you receive from then on forward. And right now in Indiana, to the best of my knowledge, there's no way to opt out of this. But the scary thing is this system works with obviously Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Louisiana, and is sharing data on over 20 million patients. Indiana has a population of 6.7 million people, but let's just be generous and say 7 million people. So 20 million patients. Now, some of those might have passed away because this is going back to 1998 when this started. And so it's really just crazy that these doctors can have access to all this information. And in some cases, that would be good. As a medically complex patient, giving your doctor access to your scans, test results, all of that would be fantastic. But when they have that preconceived notion and you have no idea, that is detrimental to your ability to get that true second opinion, because you want them a blank slate. You want to be able to walk in there and to explain what's going on and have them ask their questions without this bias, So that to me is probably the biggest threat. And this feeds into a national database as well. And I think the purpose is for continuity of care, especially when you think about snowbirds. That's a United States thing where people travel south in the winter so they don't have to, or maybe they travel west to Arizona where it's nice and warm. But they travel to warmer climates, and then their Medicaid, it can cause issues with duplicative testing and all this stuff. So I can see some benefits, but again, there has to be consent. You have to be aware of what's being shared. And, why don't they just have a portal page where you can decide what practitioners you want to have access to that? That way you're maintaining control over your records. And yet that portability is there. So that's a whole nother legislative issue, but people need to be aware of it.
Yeah, I think more people are knowing it exists now, but to what realm, I don't think we're aware of it and how that can impact us. Like you said, for wanting a clear second opinion, there was one doctor I didn't go back to because I felt like they were pretty much pushing it out on, depression, anxiety in your head kind of thing. And I was concerned that eventually if I kept going to them, that they would write a diagnosis of a generalized thing that pushed it off on, psychosomatic in your head kind of thing. And I was afraid because I knew that they were a part of a medical charting system that once it was in there, all doctors across that hospital, connecting hospitals everywhere would be able to see that diagnosis. And I was afraid that for a majority of people, once you see that, you can't unsee it. And you maybe intentionally, unintentionally have that bias of thinking, they're reporting all these symptoms. It's probably just in their head, like it was said before. So you can't get that objective second opinion. And it definitely is a benefit because you can be able to go places in emergency situations. They know your history, they get it. But at the same time, it's very detrimental. And I know a lot of these people, with my healthcare, I have a few different apps, the patient ones that I can log into, view my records. And I've noticed on one or two of them, I can actually say whether or not I want them to be connected to a different hospital. And I have the choice of connecting it or not connecting it. And some of those, I don't have the choice. So I know like a huge one here is Epic. Epic, a lot of the places are starting to transition from their other ones that aren't connected to Epic, and it's becoming a massive source of connection of your data. So please be aware of that and know that that exists. And I know sometimes you can opt in, opt out, but essentially it's out there and it can be connected. So be aware of that bias.
Well, and they say too that the information that the government is getting is quote unquote de-identified.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How quickly can they identify that information and reverse that? And so it's a big thing that people need to be aware of, and you need to be able to advocate. And so just to impress upon the fact that going back and looking at your records and seeing what they are saying is going to be really important for you to be able to advocate for yourself best. I don't believe it is this because of this, and these physiological reasons haven't been ruled out, etc., etc.
It is. It's a system where things are supposed to be made easier for us, and some have, but there has been a whole lot of mess that comes with that. And I think this is why a lot of times medical gaslighting is even more fueled in today's system because of that connection. And I don't really know the answer to that, other than I think that it's important to be aware of it and start advocating. And when you hear things, if you can stand up and, if there are bills being passed and, decisions being made with these, that you stand up and, just like you had mentioned with Indiana and that law, when it comes available, you need to be aware that it's going on around you, because it does directly affect you on a personal level.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to be fighting for some amendments in this second half of session. We're going to start January 3rd. We'll go back into legislative session. And if people are in Indiana and they want to connect, Hoosiers for Medical Liberty, that's my organization. You can find us on all the socials, h4ml.org. Connect with us, and we'd love to have your help. But I also understand that if you are facing vaccine injury, you are probably overwhelmed. So totally understand if you can't.
Absolutely. And like I said, we'll put all of those links in the description below. But Ashley, closing out, if you had to give encouragement, piece of advice, people that are trying to be their own medical advocate or an advocate for a loved one, what would it be? Your last words to them to encourage them of what they need to do?
Go with compassion and love. And the biggest person that receives that compassion and love is the person you're advocating for. Because when you come at a situation knowing that your goal is for their best interest, personally, it helps me, bring down my temper. And it gives me the ability to really work in the benefit of that person. Plus, if I'm approaching somebody with love and compassion, even if they don't deserve it, a lot of times it can help disarm them, and I can still achieve my goals for the patient. But aside from that, you deserve care. Don't allow people to good care, not just care. You deserve good care. Don't allow people to bully you, and just keep asking questions. Questions are the best way to get these the outcomes that we need. So I wish you all well. I pray for all the vaccine injured and all their advocates all the time. Don't be afraid to stand up for yourself.
Yes, thank you, Ashley. And one last time, can you tell us that organization that you use and then that medical advocacy course? And like I said, I'll put these in the description, but mention them again for us.
Yeah, Hoosiers for Medical Liberty, h4ml.org. If you're in Indiana and you're interested in preserving the right to say no to vaccines, go visit our website there. There's tons of information. We try to really make politics easy for people so you can get involved without having to be dealing with politics every day. And then my business is Wellness Through Awareness. I have a self-advocacy course that we'll have the link for. And then there are 2 freebies, and actually there's a third on my website. If you click on the tab Freebies, you'll be able to download the self-advocacy guide. It's a worksheet that kind of helps you think through some of those things. And then it links back to, if you like the content that's there, you can take that self-advocacy masterclass. It's normally $60. 60% off brings it below $20 because I know you guys got a lot going on, so I want to make that for you affordable. And then the gaslighting worksheet that kind of gives you some of these tips on how to identify and some of those responses to use back to end that gaslighting. So that's all on WTAjourney.com. And I wish you all the best. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Ashley. And remember, check out those links in the description. and 60% off. It sounds like a great course, something you can utilize, tons of resources through her website. Check those out. And thank you once again, Ashley. And don't forget about React's resources, React19. Their website houses a whole provider database full of doctors that will see you, listen to you, and get the care you need. And they also have patient advocates for you. So contact them if that's something you need or want. And if you found this episode helpful, make sure you also check out my medical advocacy playlist. I've got 2 videos that I just did recently, where one I talk about what doctors actually say and some bonus humor of what many of us would like to say or thought that we needed to say after the fact, but didn't say them, because I'll say it for you and you will completely relate. And then the second video is just some personal tips that I have found through my own journey that help you stand up and get the care you need for your medical advocacy and when you're experiencing medical gaslighting. So I'd love to hear your struggles, your stories with navigating this broken healthcare system, because we're all in this together. So comment them below and maybe we can touch base and connect and say, hey, yeah, I've definitely been through that. You hear some encouraging words from different people, but we've all been there and we can relate. And this conversation is just the beginning of reclaiming your power as a patient through medical advocacy. Medical gaslighting, it's real. And while the system may be broken, you can still take control of your health care by advocating for yourself and your loved one. Knowing your rights and refusing to be dismissed are the starting points. If you've ever felt unheard or ignored by a doctor, know that you are not alone. Your health matters and you deserve to be taken seriously. I want to help not only educate and inspire others, but also bring people together and build a community of strong, informed, and empowered patients and people like you, like me, ready to stand up and take charge of their own health care. So watch for the next episode in a couple weeks. And in the meantime, if you didn't catch the first 2 episodes where I talk about my story, how this podcast got started, and then the second one, the relationships and how you deal with love and intimacy and being chronically ill or vaccine injured, check those out because you do not want to miss those. Link is in the description below. And thank you all for watching another episode, and I will see you in the next one.